Thank you very much for everyone who's joined this evening's session and welcome. For those who don't know me, my name's Ed Holloway and I'm the Chief Executive of the Macular Society, and I'm going to be introducing our speakers this evening, and then also I'll be chairing the Q&A session once they've spoken. Tonight we're really pleased to be joined by Dr. Dirk Seidel, who is an optometrist and lecturer in optometry at the Department of Vision Sciences at Glasgow Caledonian University. Dirk has more than 20 years of teaching experience alongside a background in clinical practice and postgraduate research. His academic focus includes low vision aids, colour perception, and the assessment of colour blindness. In tonight's session, Dirk will be talking about a fascinating new technique called Biomimetic Scrolling, or BMS. This method has been developed to support people with central vision loss, where reading can be slow, tiring, and frustrating. BMS mimics the natural way our eyes move across the page and can help people to read more quickly and comfortably. Today, he'll share the outcomes of the study, how the technology works, and what it could mean for the future of reading apps and tools. There'll be time for questions at the end, so please do feel free to pop those in the chat during the session, and then we'll come to it at the end. And Dirk is also joined by his colleague, Catherine Maiden, who's on holiday at the moment, but has joined us, which is fantastic. So welcome to you both, and I'll now hand over to Dirk.
Well, thanks, Ed. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. We're going to be discussing a project which was funded by the Macular Society, and it's a pleasure to share the results of this. It's a pilot study, and the bulk of the work was actually done by my colleague Catherine. So as Ed said, I'm an optometrist. I spend most of my time teaching currently at university level, but I continue to see patients in practice, and I used to work in clinical practice. And my colleague Catherine is an experienced orthoptist. Maybe she can tell you what orthoptists actually do. They usually test the sight of young children with squints, but they're also involved in the rehabilitation of patients who have lost their vision or have lost part of their visual field. And Catherine did the bulk of the work. She did a lot of the computer programming involved to adapt the technology that we used. And our collaborator, or the third person involved in the project, was Howard Moshtail, who provided some of the scrolling text that we used in this project. I'll start with, if the technology allows me here. I don't seem to be able to. Yeah, I'll start with a little bit of a background, tell you where this comes from, where the ideas for the project come from, and then we'll go into some of the details, and we'll discuss what the technology involves and how it might be useful in the future. And the main purpose of this was to see if we can find out why people with central vision loss, why they struggle when they try and read using electronic reading apps. And this is an experience that I have quite often in clinic, that when I speak to people with macular degeneration or central vision loss, and I say to them, do you use any of these apps that you can get which help you read because they scroll the text? And a lot of patients say to me, well, I've tried it, but it's not really for me. And this is really what the background to this project is. So in our clinic, we run clinical sessions. It's in a university optometry department, and most UK optometry departments have an eye clinic associated with them, so that students get to experience real patients. And in our case, so we're the largest optometry school in Scotland, and we have about 400 students. And our eye clinic is open to the public, so patients attend the eye clinic, and we run a number of specialist clinics. And maybe 5 or 6 years ago, we started a clinic specifically for patients with strokes. And if a patient has experienced a stroke, about 60% of those who survive a stroke will have some sort of vision problem. And about 40% of people who have survived a stroke and have a vision problem, they end up with losing a large part of their field of vision. And this is this photograph here, for those of you who can see this, is not a particularly good representation, but it illustrates the fact that you can have a patient who has essentially lost half of their vision completely. So imagine a situation where you can literally take a ruler, you draw a line down the middle of the patient's vision, and the patient can't see anything on one side, anything at all. And on the other side of their vision is fairly normal. And the patient might say to you, I can see, you know, a road sign 2 miles away relatively clearly, but I walk into the wheelie bin that's right in front of me. So it's terrible. So central vision loss is obviously terrible, but patients with central vision loss tend to at least have reasonably good mobility because you can see the surroundings around you. But with these patients, they trip, they fall, they bump into things because they can't see anything at all on one side. And orthoptists, so my colleague Catherine, she works with these types of patients because when you can't see on one side, it affects the way you move your eyes. So you then need to move your eyes and your head around to be able to make up for that missing part of your vision. And this is really the background. This is where the ideas for this pilot project come from. So we used eye tracking technology, and I'll come back to that in a second. An eye tracker is essentially a machine which allows you to measure what someone's looking at and how a person's eyes, how they're pointing, what a patient is fixating. And that's really useful for someone who's a clinician or for someone who's a rehabilitation worker, because a patient with a stroke, as in this example, who needs to move their eyes extremely to one side and their head to one side to be able to see on that side if they're trying to cross a road, etc., or if they're trying to locate an item on a cluttered table. You want to know how they move their eyes if you want to help them and rehabilitate them and help them move their eyes more efficiently. And this is the original series of experiments that we designed and ran, simulated strokes, and then eventually we tried this out on real stroke patients. And for those of you who can see this, the patients were asked to identify items on a computer screen simulating different objects spread out on a table. And the eye tracker, which is essentially a little video camera that tells us what the patient's looking at, produces a spot. So those of you who have good vision can see a little black spot jumping about the picture, and that spot shows you exactly what the patient's looking at. And with the example of this patient here, who has what the technical term would be a hemianopia, so the patient can't see on their left-hand side in this case. If the patient is trying to see something on their right-hand side where they have normal vision, you can see this in the picture at the top here. The thin blue line represents the path that the patient's eyes took to identify this little button here at the top. And you can see that the patient on the side where their vision is normal, they go relatively straight and relatively quickly and move their eye towards the object that they're wanting to see. And here the patient was asked to identify the little paper clip in the bottom picture. And the paper clip is in the missing part of the patient's field. And you can see that there's lines crisscrossing all over the place. So that means that the patient's eyes moved right and left and up and down because they can't see where they're going. And the important thing about that is that your eye movements, so the way the brain controls the eye movements, are linked to the center of your vision. So if your vision, or if the center part of your vision is affected because you have lost half of your vision, or if you have central vision loss, then that affects the way you move your eye, you move your eyes. And the next step then was that we thought, well, how does it affect people when they read? And again, we started looking into this with patients who had experienced strokes and had lost parts of their peripheral vision or side vision. And the eye tracker allows you to pinpoint exactly what the patient is looking at. So here you have a line of text and a little red spot, which is jumping. And again, this is just a simulation. And it shows exactly the point of fixation that the patient's eyes point to as the patient reads. And if in a patient who reads normally, what you find is that the eyes move in a very systematic way. So the patient looks at the word, and in the simulation on the right, you can see this. There's 4 words of text, and the 3 orange blobs indicate fixation. So this is where the patient's eyes rest. And then the patient makes a saccade, a small eye movement to the next word, and the eye rests, and so on. But if you can see this, or those of you who can't see it, the patient doesn't look at every individual word, they skip words. And this is something which is very typical of someone who has good vision and is a fast reader. So I have a son who's 10 at the moment, and it was really interesting to watch him learn how to read. So when they're in P1 and they start, it is extremely slow because they're trying to look at every single letter and they're trying to join the letters together into a word, which is why children's books have large print and lots of space between the words, and which is why when children learn how to read, the book only has 5 pages. And now when I see him now, he's in P5, he reads adult print, and he reads quite fast. And because he doesn't have the vocabulary, sometimes I have to tell him to slow down because he skips things and he misses words, and then he misses the meaning of the sentence. But for an experienced reader, you achieve a high reading speed by skipping words. And the concept of that is called the visual span. So we don't look at every single word individually, we just look at portions of a line or of a sentence, and the words round about our fixation points we take in and we process without even looking at them. And that means we can jump through a line of text very, very quickly if we read normally, or if we have good vision, and if we have good eye tracking or good tracking ability, so we can move our eyes in a very systematic way, and that affects reading speed. And at the top here, you have an example of a patient who reads very fast, 286 words per minute. So normal reading speed varies and depends on a lot of different factors, print size, light, contrast, that sort of thing. 200 words per minute is normal. At the bottom here, you have a stroke patient who was reading the same line of text, and they achieved a speed of 50 words per minute. And you can see why that is, because the patient doesn't have this visual span. The patient just makes lots and lots and lots and lots of fixations because half of their vision is missing, and they're kind of moving backwards and forwards between the missing bit and the bit that they can see, and that makes reading very inefficient and very, very slow. So this is the background to this. This is where we were coming from. I don't know, Catherine, is there anything that you want to add or that you think we should add?
No, I can't. I can't think of anything just now that you've not covered. No, I think that's all good.
So, okay. So now the next thing then was that we thought, well, we were trying to help patients who had lost their vision because of a stroke, and this is not so this is not new. People have done this before, measured eye movements. But what we did was we tried to move the technology into a clinical setting. So usually this is done in a laboratory setting because the technology used to be quite extensive in terms of what was involved and weight and size and etc. And now the technology has evolved and it's small enough to move it into the clinical setting. And the next logical step then that we said, well, if we can use this in clinic with stroke patients, we should try this with patients who have experienced central vision loss. And this is a picture of a back of an eye of a patient with macular degeneration. It's dry macular degeneration, and I appreciate that the contrast isn't particularly good, so I've tried to enhance this a little bit. So essentially, the round aperture on the picture in your left shows the central part of the eye of a patient with macular degeneration. And this big patch in the middle, for those of you who can see this, there's a sort of light orange patch in the middle. That's the area of atrophy where the patient essentially can't see. And I've tried to enhance this a little bit here. So the white area is basically where the patient has very little or no vision. And you will appreciate that this is right in the center of this patient's eye. So the picture is taken through with a camera through my pupil and basically shows the back of the eye, straight into the eye. So if the center of the eye is affected, then that's obviously where the macula is. And the macula is the part of the eye that we use when we read small detail, or when we want to see any small detail, when we look at a face, when we look at a road sign, that sort of thing. And you'll appreciate that obviously if your vision is poor in that central area, then reading will be very difficult, because in the area, so in the white area here on your right, which I've tried to simulate, the patient can't see anything. So the text that would be projected onto the white area or onto the macula, the patient wouldn't see. It would just look blurred. It would look come and go, and it would look fuzzy. And in a real eye, the text is actually upside down because the image is upside down, but for illustration, this will do. So now if the patient wants to read or see detail, what they will have to do is they will have to move their eye. So in this case, the patient would move their eye up so that the patch, the macula, where the atrophy is, where the patient can't see, moves down, moves out of the way. And as it moves down, then the text falls onto an area on the retina where there's better visual function the patient can see. Now, the problem is that as you move away from the macula, your vision naturally gets worse. And that's the same in any eye, in an eye with very good central vision. If you're looking out of your periphery, your vision's blurred in your periphery. So what then happens is you need to give the patient a magnifier. Patient uses a magnifier, the print is enlarged. And now you think about this concept of the visual span. So what that means is you're enlarging the print and your visual span essentially shrinks. And that is why when I give patients a magnifier, and it's a strong magnifier, they will then say to me, well, I can see it now, but I can only see one word at a time. Or I can only see 2 words at a time, or a few letters at a time if the magnifier is very strong. And some people will then say, well, that's just how it is. You need to get on and practice. But this is where this idea comes from, that technology might be the way to help with this. Interestingly, this is a bit of a side note. This is another patient with central vision loss. And I've tried to, again, enhance the image a little bit. And the white blob that you can see on the right-hand side is the patient's optic nerve. Nobody sees with their optic nerve, so it's perfectly normal that the patient can't see there. And the scotoma that this patient has is so small you can't even see it. So this patient, so the previous patient, they have extremely poor vision. So they can see the first letter, the top line on an eye chart, but they have to be very close, half a meter from the eye chart, that sort of thing. This patient has driving standard. So they have a very, very small macular hole, which you can barely appreciate on the photograph here. They still really struggle with reading, even though they don't need to move their eye really, but the macular hole makes the text a little bit distorted. And that goes back to what I said earlier. If you're moving, when you're reading and you're moving your eyes in a systematic way from right to left, if you're reading from left to right, if you're reading left to right, if something interferes with the center of your vision and makes your vision a bit blurry or makes your vision a bit distorted, it affects your eye movements. And that is why even patients who have relatively good vision, but they have a central vision defect, that is why they still struggle with reading. And thinking about the visual span, so that it's quite small, but when you use a magnifier, it's smaller even when you use eccentric viewing. So you move your eye away from what you want to see. It would make sense that scrolling the text rather than moving your eye along the line of text, that scrolling the text across the page and keeping your eye steady should make it easier. And I don't know, I would be interested, maybe afterwards, if we could do a little poll, I would be interested how many of you use the EV Reader app. So there are a number of apps and software that's available which makes text move in various ways, and the Macular Society funded this a number of years ago, and it's called the EV Reader app. And in our university eye clinic, the patients that we tend to have in our low vision clinic are not your typical low vision patients, because we tend to see people who have end stage macular conditions and tend to have very poor vision. And we're quite happy about that because it gives the students something to look at and to learn. It's good for student experience. But what it means is that we tend to see a lot of people who have very poor vision and who've given up on reading. And whenever I ask patients, do you use the EV Reader app or any of these apps? No, not for me. I've tried it, but no, it doesn't work for me. And so we were thinking about why that might be. Why is it that, and you always hear that when you speak to people about these apps and about scrolling text, a lot of people say, yeah, it works, but it's not for everyone. Well, who is it for then? And there are various ways of scrolling the text. So you can have something which is called RSVP, Rapid Serial Visual Presentation, which is the example at the top here, where you have the focus word. So there's one word which is always in the center of the screen, and it's essentially flashed. So the text doesn't scroll, it flashes word by word. And in theory, it should make it easy if you don't move your eye. If you use eccentric viewing, you just look away, find where your vision's best, and then the text just flashes. But relatively few people use these. Or you get apps where the text scrolls continuously. And that's the example at the bottom here. And of course, with these apps, you can set how fast it scrolls, how slow it goes, etc. And a lot of people, when you speak to them, why do you not use it? Why have you tried it? Yeah, I've tried it. Why do you not use it? Oh, it's just tiring. It's really tiring. And a few years ago, it was Harriet Watt University in Edinburgh and the University of Edinburgh. They came up with this concept of the biomimetic scrolling. I think it was called saccadic scrolling. And the idea is to make the text move in a way which simulates the natural eye movement. So going back to what I said at the start, when a person with normal vision reads, they systematically look at specific sections of the text. They jump between words, they don't look at every single word, and they make systematic eye movements. And every so often they stop and keep their gaze on a word, and then they move again to the next word. And this is what this biomimetic scrolling does. And in theory, it makes perfect sense. So it kind of moves the text, and when there's a more difficult word or a word which is not very common, it stops for longer. And then words which are very common and which are used all the time, it skips and it moves faster. So essentially, it mimics what a normal reader would do. And what we found with patients who have normal vision or with patients who have strokes is that you can achieve extremely high reading speeds with this. So patients with normal vision, as I said, for a standard line of text, 200 words per minute is a reasonably good average. Patients with normal vision can do 1,000 words per minute with this biomimetic scrolling. Did I get that right, Catherine? Is there anything that you? Yeah, good. Okay, so the project, or this project, was to try, or from our point of view, two things. A, to see whether we can use eye tracking technology in clinic with patients, and B, to see whether we can measure eye movements when patients use or read text which scrolls in the sort of standard smooth scroll, the way the EV Reader app presents it, compared to the biomimetic scroll. And I said earlier, eye tracking technology has evolved. So 10, 15 years ago, we had eye trackers that we used in the lab either came as a big set of goggles with sensors in them, or similar to what you see on the left here is a photograph of someone with a helmet type device, and it has a video camera in it and then mirrors which capture a reflection of the person's eye, and that video camera then records whether the eye moves right or left or up or down. And of course, you can't use this in the clinic. So we are using an eye tracker which was designed for computer gamers. And it's essentially, you can see this in the photograph on the right here, it's a tiny little plastic strip with some red lights in it. So these are infrared lights. The camera here makes them look much brighter than they are. You barely notice them, so because the eye doesn't see infrared particularly well. And it's clipped onto the computer screen, and it records the position of the patient's eyes by tracking the patient's pupil. It's a bit like when you take a photograph of your cat at night and the two cat eyes light up. It's a similar principle. So it sends infrared light into the eye, and it takes a picture of the reflections of the pupils. And that way the camera can then track whether the pupil is moving to the right or to the left or up and down. Now, for the clinician, or for someone who does vision rehabilitation work, I always thought that's a really, and I've discussed this with rehabilitation workers, that's a really good thing to have in clinic if you can see what a patient's eyes are actually doing, especially if you're trying to train if you're trying to explain to the patient why they don't see particularly well. So if someone has central vision loss, if you can show them how their eyes move, they understand much better why their vision comes and goes, because the eye is moving and it's not particularly well controlled. Or if someone's had a stroke and half of their field of vision is affected, then their eyes move in a different way. So it's good from the patient's point of view to understand what the problem is, but it's also for the clinician, obviously, if we can see what the patient's actually looking at when we're trying to teach them how to turn their eye and how to view eccentrically and which way their vision is best and which way they need to look for where their vision is not particularly good and etc. So it's good to objectively to be able to measure this objectively. And just going to skip this for those of you who can see this. The eye tracker is calibrated because obviously everybody's eyes are slightly different. And for those of you who have good vision, there are two little spots here on the screen. So following the calibration, we can now see exactly where the patient's right and where the patient's left eye are looking at. And if the patient moves their eyes, then the little spots move about. And why is that useful? This is an example of one of the patients who participated in this pilot study. And you can see this patient uses eccentric viewing. So they're looking a little bit to the right and a little bit down to what they're actually trying to see. So the 4 white spots in the photograph on the left shows the screenshot of part of the experiment, and the 4 white spots are the locations that or the targets that we asked the patient to look at. So we were saying to the patient, can you look at the white spot in the middle? And the eye tracker recorded what the patient was actually looking at. And these little red dots show you that the patient was, when they were trying to see the center of the screen, they were actually looking to the right a little bit and down a little bit. So in clinic, for me as a clinician, that means I can quantify exactly how that patient's moving their eye and what part of their retina they're actually using to view a spot in this case, or to read. And following this calibration, we then ask patients to read text on the screen, just in the same way that the example on the right shows. So we obviously worked out what the size of the text had to be for each patient. So it's the same as reading with a magnifier, except the patients were reading magnified text on the screen. And in the first part of the experiment, patients were reading static text, so a single line of text. So they had to move their eyes to simulate natural reading. In the second part of the experiment, we were moving the text was scrolling continuously. And in the third part of the experiment, the patients had to do it all again. And this time we used the biomimetic scrolling. So the text was moving and stopping and moving and stopping to simulate the natural eye movements. And this is what we found. So you've got a chart here of 3 bars, and the bar on the left, the height of the bars tells you how fast the patients were reading on average. And the higher the bar, the better. So 300 words per minute is at the top, and very low reading speeds obviously at the bottom. So the higher the bar, the better. On the left bar gives you the reading speed in the static condition. So this was just print on the screen. The print didn't move, the patient had to move their eyes. Average reading speed was about 50 words per minute for the group of patients. On the right, you see the reading speed for the biomimetic scrolling. So stop and start and stop and start. Average was about 80. And in the middle is continuous scroll, where the text just moves smoothly, and that's the average was in between. So let's say it was 60. So the first conclusion was, when the text moves and someone who has central vision loss keeps their eyes straight, that's quicker. They can read faster. That's nothing new. It's been shown numerous times before that scrolling text or serial visual presentation, rapid serial visual presentation is better than moving your eye. But the biomimetic scroll, even though the average was a little bit higher than for the normal scroll, statistically there wasn't much in it. So the conclusion so far was, yeah, if the print moves, that's better. But it doesn't really matter how the print moves, whether it moves smoothly or whether it stops and starts. And when I was looking at the data, it occurred to me that there was very big differences between individuals, between patients. So some patients seem to improve a lot and really a lot with the biomimetic scrolling, and some people didn't get on with it at all and didn't read any faster. And when I looked at the patients, there seemed to be three natural groups. One group of patients, what I'm showing here is the change in reading speed, again in words per minute. So the height of the bars shows how much faster a patient was reading when the text was scrolling. And the dark blue bar on the left is the continuous scroll, and the slightly lighter greenish bar to the right of it is the biomimetic scroll. And there's three sets of these bars. The first one on the left here shows you people who started off with a very slow reading speed. So when I say started off, I mean static text. So these are patients with relatively advanced macular disease, and they're reading round about 40 words per minute or less. Now, from a practical point of view, 40 words per minute is when you look up a phone number or something like that, or you look at a price tag, you can do that with 40 words per minute. You would not be able to read a book with 40 words per minute. You would probably struggle to even read a short email with 40 words per minute because it takes too long. And on the right here, you have patients whose basic reading speed for standard text was 80 words per minute or better. And again, I'm showing the change in reading speed with the scrolling. And if for those of you who can see this, you'll appreciate that scrolling seems to give you a greater absolute improvement when you're already a fast reader. Whereas when you're a slow reader, the scrolling doesn't really change your reading speed much. In research papers, it doubles it, but there's always and it doubles it here. So let's say someone who reads at 40 words per minute, when the text scrolls, they go up to 80. With 80 words per minute, you're still not going to read books. So there's always a difference between a sort of scientifically, statistically significant effect and a practical effect. So my view on this is that if you're a slow reader, scrolling the text will help, but it'll not make you read books because it will not be fast enough. But if you're a reader who is almost or just a little bit below normal reading speed, so you find it cumbersome to read longer documents, then with a scrolling text app, you're definitely getting a greater absolute improvement. And it seems that people who have a relatively fast reading speed to start with, that they get a much greater benefit from the biomimetic scrolling. So the stop and start seems to work best for people who are already relatively fast readers, or in terms of macular disease, those who are either have a condition which only slightly reduces their central vision, or are at the start of the progress where the disease hasn't progressed particularly far. And to finish this off, we'll show you why we think it is the case that people who read quickly already, they seem to benefit most from the biomimetic scrolling. So this is the eye tracking data. It's fixation trace of two patients reading a line of text. And on the left, you have a patient with very poor vision, and they read very slowly, 20 words per minute. And the blue spots, again, they represent individual fixations. So points on the page where the patient's eye rested, where their gaze, where their gaze stopped before they moved. And you can see it's moving backwards and forwards, which is why reading is so slow. And on the right, you have a patient who was reading 130 words per minute, and you can see there are much fewer fixations. And it is the case that the more fixations you make, the slower it is. Whether the text is a normal text, a line of text, and you move your eye, or whether the text scrolls and you try and keep your eye steady. So the fewer fixations you make, the better you're reading. And these are two examples of patients reading scrolling text. At the top here, you have a patient who's a slow reader. And on the left, you've got continuous scroll. And for those of you who can see this, the little fixation spots, they have a tendency to move to the left a little bit. And that's because the text was scrolling. And we were obviously trying to get these patients to read as fast as possible. So, after half an hour of helping us with this research, some people were extremely tired. And the fixations, they have a tendency to be spread out to the left because the patient was constantly trying to catch up because the text was moving so quickly. So you would think that making the text stop and start so quickly for the patient, so we would think that making the text stop and start would help, but it doesn't. Because it doesn't stop long enough, and the patient is then constantly trying to move their eye right and left and up and down to find the next word and to find the position where they actually were on that line and in that sentence. And that is why if your vision is poor and your fixations are inaccurate, the biomimetic scrolling doesn't seem to make a difference. Whereas a patient who reads standard text with very few fixations because they've got relatively good vision, the scrolling text, this is the example at the bottom left here. You can see very few of these little fixation dots. Again, the patient's trying to catch up, so the dots have a tendency to be skewed to the left a little bit. But when you use the biomimetic algorithm, all the spots are in one place, which means patient keeps their eye extremely steady, and that means they can achieve a high reading speed. So the take, or what I take home from this is that it really, in clinic, we've confirmed what the research has shown for years, that the steadier you can keep your eye, the faster you can read. And that's the case whether you move the text and you keep your eye steady and it's just a printed page of text, or if you use a scrolling text up, the steadier you can keep your eye, the better. The second thing, which was interesting for me to confirm that in a clinical setting with cheap eye tracking technology, is that scrolling text is better than static text, but with the caveat that it works best for people who already have relatively good reading speed, or I should say who still have relatively good reading speed, whereas unfortunately those patients where the disease is advanced and their reading is very slow, they don't seem to benefit from the scrolling text as much as the patients who have relatively good vision. I've taken far longer than I intended. Catherine, is there anything you think I've missed or anything that wasn't clear?
No, I don't think so. I would maybe add possibly for the standard scrolling, we think maybe the reason there wasn't a massive difference is because the patients found it predictable. They could tell they knew what speed the words were traveling through, whereas with the biomimetic, because the pauses for each of the words varied based on the programming, the algorithm, which was based on how long the word was and how common the word was. That was much harder for patients with very poor vision to then predict, to know how long it was going to stay static. So I think that's probably partly as well why. And we've also got the crossover that, the slower the reader, it tends to be their vision is worse, and so the text needs to be bigger anyway. So then there isn't, there's less being shown on the screen at once, so we're having to magnify the words much more, which then slows reading down again. So, but otherwise, nothing else to add. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. A really, really interesting presentation. Fascinating to hear what's going on with these kinds of issues and what's going on with the apps. And I think, one thing we hear a lot about is varied experience. Things work for some people and don't work for others. And it's really helpful to start to understand that, isn't it? And understand what might be driving that, so we can make sure people are accessing the right thing for them. We've had a few questions come in, and we may get some more come in as we talk. So I'll just start asking some questions from those who've joined us in the chat. So just ask away for those who are watching. So there's a question about which apps are still available, as a couple of people have said the EV Reader app they don't think is still available from the App Store.
The EV Reader app should still be available. I haven't checked recently, but in the last 6 months it was available, I would say. The web version is definitely available. So for the PC, you can go on the URL is evplatform.org, I think, and on the PC it works. What isn't available is the Biomimetic app. So the original research, which was funded by Harriet Watt, I think, in Edinburgh, I think it was a spin-off company that they created, and they ran a website. And unfortunately, I think they ran into financial difficulties, and the website's not available. And I'm not sure whether there are any plans to make it live again or not. So unfortunately, the Bright page, which is the biomimetic scrolling, is currently not available. But the standard scrolling should be. There are other apps as well. I must admit, I always ask patients, because they seem to know much better than me what's available, because these things change all the time. And sometimes you use one and you recommend one, and then 6 months later it's all of a sudden subscription only.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the EV Reader platform is definitely at least on the PC, it's available.
Okay. Well, if there are people in the chat who've got particular recommendations, please do share them, and we can sort of relay them. And actually, I think you've answered a couple of the other questions. So one of the questions was whether this technique was related to the work done on the Bright Page app a few years ago, and you're saying that is the biomimetic app, which is not available at the moment. And I guess we would hope that someone might bring forward a version of that at some point. And people have asked how we can access biomimetic scrolling on a computer or phone, and the answer is currently that's not possible. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
So the other thing is, which is why we were, which one another reason that we did this project, was that the Bright Page app was designed for speed reader to help people with normal vision to speed read.
Right.
So the algorithm, so you can imagine, if you have normal vision, your eye movements will be different. So they'll be quicker, the pauses will be different, the amount of, or the size of the saccade, so from one word to the next word, the step size will be different. And we wanted to understand whether this had to be adapted. So the original Bright Page work, as I understand it, they measured eye movements of patients with normal vision, and they then remodeled that to make the text move in the same way that a normal eye moves. But of course, someone who has poor vision, they'll not read like a normal person. So
Yeah.
you'll have to rethink and redesign the algorithm to suit a patient with reduced vision. And that's one of the things that I think where this is hopefully going to go, that you have technology such as an eye tracker, and these eye trackers are so cheap now. So the one that we had in our project, about £200. 20 years ago, eye trackers were 15, 20, 25,000 pounds. So the technology is so much more accessible now that we are thinking about using it for patients, to give it to patients, to lend it to patients to do rehabilitation at home. And if you get feedback, if you're scrolling text and you're trying to find the best position, well, if the eye tracker can give you feedback of how to move your eye, well, that should make it much more efficient. So we think that adjusting the algorithm dynamically based on how a patient reads, that's the way that I would imagine it in the future. It's a way off, but at some point, hopefully, that's where it'll go.
So I think someone's thinking along the same lines as you. That asked, is scrolling speed controlled by the subjects? And I think you're saying that the current algorithm not, but it might be
So the
automatically.
with any reading app, the scrolling speed can be controlled, so it can be set. So usually in the app or on a web version of any app, it'll allow you to tell the app how fast or how slow you want to scroll it. Yes. But with the Biomimetic, and the EV reader does that as well. So there's a little slider at the bottom that you can change the speed. But the key for the biomimetic is that the algorithm pauses when the word is more difficult, so that you get more time to read the difficult word, and then you can skip about the short, easy words. And we feel that that is something that would need to be individually tailored to the patient to get the best out of the algorithm. Yeah.
Fascinating. A slightly different question. I wonder if you could talk about eye movement versus head movement. There's a request to comment on eye movement versus head movement.
It depends on the purpose. So for reading, so when I have a patient with macular degeneration and a large central scotoma, so their vision is poor, their macular vision is poor, the way we would traditionally teach it is we would find the area in the back of their eye where they can see best, and we then tell them to move their eye and keep their head nice and straight and move their eye until their vision is clearest, and then they move the text and they keep their eye and they keep their head straight. And it's the same for using, let's say, magnifiers. If you have an optical magnifier and you read along a line of text, the best way to do it is to move the magnifier and your head as a unit together. The worst you can do is move your eyes and the magnifier and the head in different directions, because then the print will be all over the place. So nice and steady, head as steady as you can, eye as steady as you can, and then you move the print. So this would be for someone with a macular problem. It's completely different for a patient with a stroke. So if you have lost your peripheral vision, you want to encourage those patients to move their head and their eye as much as they can together. Yeah, so there is no yes or no answer. It totally depends on the patient, but generally with macular conditions, head straight, eye straight, or into the eccentric reading position, and then keep everything as straight as you can and move the text.
Thank you. And a question about reading glasses and whether reading prescription glasses are better than varifocals for reading performance. Do you have a view on that?
Yes, I do. For patients with macular problems, generally, yes, reading glasses. I would recommend that. And the reason for that is that the varifocals restrict your reading because the power is quite narrow. If you want restricted in the bottom of the lens, so the patient with the varifocal, they have to find the point in the lens where they use for their near vision to be clear. And of course, if you then try and use eccentric viewing, that's not going to work. Often, what I would say, of course, if you have reading glasses on, you can't see in the distance. So the best thing, or often what I would say patients do is they have a pair of varifocals just for general use if they go to the shops, etc. And then when they sit down to read something, they have a pair of reading glasses. That's probably the best, so that you don't accidentally walk around with your reading glasses on. That wouldn't be good.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. And forgive me, I don't know what this acronym means, but I'm hoping you will. Can you comment about RSSVP combined with biomimetic scrolling?
That was presumably the rapid serial visual presentation.
Right.
So this is when the text flashes one word at a time.
Okay.
That's completely different because, again, the biomimetic scrolling, the idea is that you mimic what the eyes naturally do, which is they move and they stop and they move and they stop, whereas the RSVP is flash, 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 flash. Both research has shown that the RSVP makes you read faster if you have normal vision, but also if you have poor vision. But again, it's very unnatural, which is why a lot of people don't get on with it and don't like it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, both of you, and thank you everyone for all of your questions. Really, really interesting to hear about this. Something that was new to me, I must admit, biomimetic screening, but really, really interesting. So thank you so much. Our next webinar will be on Tuesday, the 17th of June at 7 p.m. and we'll be joined by Dr. Jasleen Jolly, who'll be discussing her research into the neuroscience of vision loss and Charles Bonnet syndrome. And I know Charles Bonnet syndrome is something we hear about from lots of people living with macular disease, so it should be another really interesting session. So thank you again to Dirk and Catherine, and thank you everyone for joining and for all of your questions. And I hope you all have a lovely rest of the evening. Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.